Well, yesterday I was talking about how that we need to be careful that we don't put our trust in what Peter described as perishable things. In other words, everything in the material world is subject to decay. And even though we think about silver and gold and diamonds and precious gems and things like that as being non-decayable, they all can be destroyed. If you have enough heat, enough pressure, all of those things can be broken down to their basic elements and become valueless as a consequence. And so he said, be careful that you don't put your trust in those things, with the implication that what we're going to do is we're going to put our trust in God. So the very first step that he outlines for us pursuing a life that's defined by holiness, which means that we're wholly focused upon him and his leadership and his goals for our life, is that we don't let ourselves be distracted and begin to think that things that seem to us to be rock solid and reliable are in fact very perishable. I think about, in saving up or planning and preparing for retirement, that even people who have done a really exceptional job and have built up a treasure that they believe will carry them for the rest of their life, there's two very real weaknesses in that perspective, in that confidence, if you will. The first one is you assume that your life is going to last a certain period of time. So they always ask the question, do you have enough money to carry you through retirement? Well, the point is, I don't know when my life is going to end, so I can't answer that question. You probably should be more concerned whether or not those who survive you will be able to have enough to carry them through. So I'm not belittling the idea of storing up, but the idea is we assume that we know how long we're going to be here, and we have no idea. We have no idea what it's going to require. We may be here much longer than we had anticipated, and then you find out that you're running out of resources, or you may find that you stored up many things and don't have need of them because the Lord has taken you home and solved all your retirement problems for you, by the way. But he said, don't put them in those perishable things like silver and gold, but instead, he said, realize this. He said that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your forefathers. This word redeemed is really kind of interesting because it means to be ransomed. It's kind of the idea that when somebody's been taken hostage or they were put in debtor's prison, that this is the word they would use to say that somebody came and paid your fee, your debt, your obligation, and now you're free from that obligation. Now, what we as Christians need to always keep in mind is we are forgiven, but we're not innocent. We have been acquitted, but we are guilty as charged. In other words, we're sinners who have been saved by the grace and the mercy of God, and that doesn't mean that what we did in the past didn't happen or doesn't exist. It's just that God is no longer counting it against us. And so there's kind of this balance, I think, that is important for maintaining a proper humility, that I recognize that I'm a sinner who is saved by grace. I recognize that I incurred a debt that I could not pay, and Christ came and paid the debt that he did not owe. And so that perspective is what I think keeps us in a right humility before God, that we don't become arrogant and thinking that somehow, now that I'm a Christian, I'm sinlessly perfect and I don't have to think about or even feel responsible for bad things I did. Because the things that I did in my past that were bad, I'd still have a sense of responsibility socially and relationally. In other words, when I do or say something that hurts my wife's feelings and makes her feel bad, I can ask her to forgive me, and she invariably does and says, yeah, I forgive you. But the fact is that I've still done something that has caused her pain, and it's my responsibility to figure out how can I behave differently in the future so that she doesn't have to be experiencing that pain. And so I don't feel like God's going to punish me because of my oversight or my failure, but I do understand that other people have suffered because of things I've said and I've done. And so it's part of this balance of knowing that I'm forgiven and living in that grace, but also carrying personal responsibility, that I don't feel like I have no obligation. In other words, when somebody breaks the law and they're arrested and put in jail and they come to Christ, that's a wonderful thing, but they still have to pay their debt to society. They still have to be resolved and reconciled with regards to how they've harmed people within society. And it's our repentance, that change of life where we begin to act as a different person, that becomes the basis of our testimony. And so it's really important to understand that we are redeemed. We're not innocent in the sense that we incurred a debt and God has forgiven us that debt. And that's why Paul, in writing to Timothy, said to him in chapter 1, I think it's verse 12, where he said, I was chief amongst sinners. I mean, he talks about his own self, that he was the enemy of the church and he persecuted the believers. Paul never forgot that what he had done. He knew that he was forgiven, but he didn't forget that that was part of his life before he was a Christian. And he always remembered that the grace of God was so abundant because of the greatness of his transgression. And there's a balance there that I think that keeps us psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, humble and well-balanced individuals, that we don't forget that we have no rights to anything. We are simply gifted things, but we have no rights to those things. In fact, we celebrated one of my grandson's 10th birthday yesterday with the family, and it's always a fun time, but he had a bunch of gifts. I've never seen so many gifts at one birthday party in my life, but he has older siblings and everybody was buying him all this different stuff, which was so cute. But the whole point was that he didn't have a right to any of that stuff. Those were gifts that were given. They chose to bless him. They chose to show him that he is loved and he's valued. And the gifts become a reflection of that. And so it is in my life, that I have been given the gift of eternal life. And by the very reception of that gift, I recognize that my life has worth and value. Before I was saved, I was desperately trying to do or accomplish something so that I could convince other people that my life had worth and value. And that's why, as he goes on, he says, we've been redeemed from our empty way of life. The word empty there can be rendered in various different ways. It can mean aimless. In other words, we're just trying to find our direction out here, going from thing to thing, pillar to post. It can mean futile, that it's a point where we basically say, this is pointless. What's it worth? But basically, our life had no ultimate sense of fulfillment and satisfaction. And most of us can readily identify with that dynamic, that before we got saved, we spent a lot of time doing things that we thought would bring us happiness or pleasure or the accolades and approval of other people. People talk about leaving a legacy behind and so forth and so on. But the reality is that even if you accomplish the greatest things that are imaginable in this life, when you die, you will be forgotten within a very short period of time. My dad used to always tell me, he says, I'll be forgotten 10 minutes after I'm dead. And he was wrong. I still remember him, but I don't think about him as much as I did when he was still here. And what he did in his life that he lived, it becomes less significant to me at this point, because really, the reality is, until he came to Christ, his life was one that was pointless and futile, even though he accomplished a great many things in his lifetime. So I think he says that we need to understand that that prior life was empty. It was a way of life, but it was handed down to us from our forefathers. In other words, we adopted the not only the strengths, but also the weaknesses of our parents. That I often point out in my book on parenting. I talk about how that sometimes Christian parents are trying to raise sinlessly perfect kids, and it's virtually impossible to do that because, first of all, they're born into a sinful world, so they're going to be touched by all sorts of sinful influences. That secondly, part of that sinful influences is their parents. Your parents are sinners. So you can be angry and blame your parents for all sorts of things that they did and shouldn't have done. But in the reality, we can't really expect them to behave a whole lot different because they themselves were sinners and they behaved in sinful ways, some to more degree than others. But the last thing I think most importantly is I am a sinner, my kids are sinners, and they have a choice. They can choose to imitate the sinful examples they see in the world and from their parents, or they can choose to follow the examples set to them by Christ in His Word. And so ultimately, the responsibility for who I am and the decisions and choices I make falls upon me. And yet we live in an era where people are always trying to transfer the responsibility, much like Adam and Eve tried to do it. Eve blamed the serpent. Adam blamed Eve, and even in some ways implied that it was God's problem for bringing her and the serpent into his life. This is something that we do. We try to project the blame because sin is such an unbearably heavy weight that we pretend to not have sin just to try to escape it. But the truth of the matter is, we live in a sinful world. We have sinful parents that raised us, and sinful siblings who influenced us, and sinful friends who touched our lives, and we ourselves are sinners. As my dad said to my brother and I one day, he said, I used to think that you guys were being influenced by bad people, and then I realized you may be the bad influence on other people. So it was kind of an embarrassing and sobering moment in our life. But the simple fact is that we tend to imitate the examples that are set before us. Well, we're out of time, and I'll continue this conversation tomorrow. Look forward to it. God bless you and go in His grace.